Welcome to the Coming Home Well podcast, the show that educates, supports, and advocates for the veteran community. Your host, Dr. Tyler Piron, U.S. Army retired, will bring you exciting conversations with amazing guests about resources, research, and military history, all geared to helping our warriors to come home well. Here's your host, Dr. Tyler Piron.
Welcome back to Coming Home Well. I'm your host, Tyler Piron. And in concurrence with our theme about some of the new things that are happening across the veteran space, we are going to be talking about the PACT Act. You might have heard about it, in passing, but there's a lot of things that you really should know because it's changing a lot of the landscape for veterans to get benefits. So we have Samantha Allen, as she works at the Department of Veteran Services, has a law degree from the University of Richmond, and works on appeals for veterans with the Department of Veteran Services. So she sees a lot of the things that are happening across the veteran space, especially in regards to the PACT Act. Sam, thank you so much for joining us on Coming Home Well.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
So what is the PACT Act? What does that even stand for?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's actually the Sergeant First Class Heath Robinson honoring our promise to address comprehensive toxins Act of 2022. And that's
a mouthful.
But that's the PACT Act. And actually, what is more interesting, I think, is who is Heath Robinson, which I didn't know at first. And because we've been educating people on the PACT Act, we thought it would be important to know at least a little bit about the person behind the name of the law. And he was a Sergeant First Class Army National Guard veteran who was diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disorder and lung cancer after serving in Kosovo and Iraq, where he had prolonged exposure to burn pits. And he unfortunately passed in 2020. So he is sort of the name behind the law and represents so much of what the PACT Act is meant to help aid in, the access to benefits for this population of veterans who served kind of post 9/11, although we have a lot of veterans who benefit from the PACT Act, and we'll get into that. But that's who Heath Robinson is. So we like to make sure we have a name behind the law.
Yeah, there's so many of those cases. I guess he's the one that they said, hey, look, this is the emblematic case that we really need to change these laws because of this.
Right. Absolutely. And that burn pit exposure is a lot of people now sort of associate the PACT Act with burn pit exposure, even though it is more comprehensive to include toxic exposure and actually increased access to benefits for veterans who served in the Vietnam era. And it also helps our Camp Lejeune veterans with exposures that they experience with contaminated water. So it's very broad, but burn pits is very commonly associated with the PACT Act. I think John Stewart was really avid about his advocacy for this passage, and many other celebrities and active advocates in this space. So we're glad it was passed in 2022.
Yeah, these burn pits, they had everything from fuel to feces to batteries to you name it. If it was excess, they were throwing it in the burn pile, and
Right.
all sorts of chemicals and nastiness. And I think they're only now realizing all the long-term health consequences of burning all the things you should never be burning and breathing.
Right. And then living next to those burn pits for months and months at a time in some cases, if not longer.
Oh,
yeah. So you had no reprieve from that.
Depends on which way the wind was blowing, right? That's never good. So we have the PACT Act. It passed in 2020. It covers a lot of stuff. What are some of the highlights of the things, the PACT Act? What should people know?
Yeah, so it passed on August 10 of 2022. So this is very new. August 10 of 2022 was signed into law under President Biden. And these claims began processing just over a year ago, January 1, 2023. And there is some confusion. I want to be clear. There's no deadline to the PACT Act. It doesn't expire. This is law. So this is now federal law, and this will stand just like Agent Orange presumption has stood since that law went into effect years ago. So the PACT Act is here to stay, which is great for many, many veterans. And there's actually some data that came out that over 1 million claims have been filed since it was passed in 2022. as of this fall. So as of September, October 2023. So undoubtedly more claims have been filed since then. And those are claims for veterans who previously were denied, for surviving spouses, for veterans who have never filed before, or veterans who just got out after the passage of the PACT Act. So our newer veterans. So 1 million plus veterans is actually not surprising at all. And that likely includes a number of surviving spouses who are claiming a service-connected death for the passage of their veteran. Benefits for everyone, really important. And what it does, the PACT Act, it's a law that expands access to VA healthcare, access to VA disability compensation benefits, largely for veterans who are exposed to burn pits, Agent Orange exposure, and then other toxic substances. They added a number of health conditions to their presumptive list, which is really important. So we'll walk through some of that. But overall, this is perhaps the largest healthcare and benefit expansion in VA history. So VA is very proud of the PACT Act. And I will say the VA website is actually excellent. It's an excellent resource for the PACT Act. It's va.gov, resources, PACT Act, your VA benefits, and pretty much every question you can think of should be on there. There's an FAQ section, but of course, you can always reach out to someone to get more information. But I have to give the VA credit. They've done an excellent job of educating people on the PACT Act because of how sweeping its reaches. So it's important, not only because of the expansion of benefits, but the expansion of healthcare, which is very significant for veterans.
Huge.
Adding the new presumptive conditions. And again, I'll walk through that in a little bit. It also added locations. And I have a personal anecdote I might share along the way of a veteran who we've been trying to get granted for years, who finally now under PACT Act, because it broadened the locations that they included for Agent Orange exposure presumption, is now granted under PACT Act. So now he's 100% permanent in total. He's been not service connected for years. So it's such a success story for someone that really was deserving for other reasons. So I'll get into that a little bit later, but seeing the real tangible impact of that in a positive way is very exciting as an advocate and a VSO. They also added toxic screening for veterans. So if you're enrolled in VA healthcare, you can now get a screening at your healthcare facility to see if you did have that toxic exposure. And there's a list of questions and a physical exam that you can go under. And then overall, it helps improve research and education and treatment related to toxic exposures. Like you said, these veterans were exposed years ago, and only now are we realizing the negative and life-altering and fatal impacts of the exposure, much like we didn't know at the time. So we say, right, about the negative effect of herbicide exposure in Vietnam. And then all these years later, we have a host of disabilities that many veterans who were exposed to Agent Orange are grappling with. So very similar, right? We're on that same path of, we learn now what the real negative impact is, and how do we try to make a veteran or the surviving spouse whole. And I think the PACT Act, goes in the right direction in a lot of ways. It will never make anyone whole. But it does do a lot to give them the compensation, give them the access to healthcare and the education that they're deserving of and entitled to, and we owe it to them, right, to do that for them. So I have a lot of good things to say about the PACT Act.
So you said that it's one of the largest expansions of access and benefits in the VA history. That's a big statement. Is it like that substantial?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I think it's because if you think about the presumption that it essentially creating these presumptions, it eases the burden for a veteran or a surviving spouse to establish that they have a disability from service. So when you look at, and I'll just sort of, go right to the Agent Orange exposure, and how that has been impacted by the PACT Act, because it's lesser known in a way than the burn pit exposure that everybody's talking about. But when you look at the impact of our, Vietnam era veterans, who are actually a very large population right now that we're serving, adding two diseases, hypertension and what's called monoclonal gammopathy of an undetermined significance, or MGUS, MGUS is another acronym, which is a blood disorder. adding those two conditions as presumptive conditions for Agent Orange exposure, especially hypertension. Many, many veterans have hypertension. So now this means that a veteran who's service connected for hypertension, because he served it in the Vietnam era, has Agent Orange exposure conceded, he can, maybe even if he's 0% for hypertension, he can still get his blood pressure medication for free at a VA facility. So now these veterans who are realizing that they can get their health care and they can get their medications, their prescriptions at, because obviously the cost of medications is rising and it's a huge burden on the veteran.
Yeah.
When the VA can finally eat that cost by making it easier for the veteran to have access to it because they've made it easier for them to demonstrate that their conditions from service, it's the ripple effect of that is huge. And it's, in this case, it was hypertension and this blood disorder, but in previous years, we had other conditions added when they had the Blue Water Navy Passage Act come through, and they added different conditions. So every time they add new presumptives for different eras of veterans, it makes it easier for them to get access to healthcare, get their prescriptions, and get compensation, which is what I deal with mostly, is disability compensation. And when we look at the Agent Orange exposed veterans who are most benefited by the PACT Act, it's really the locations that they added for Agent Orange presumption. So
I'm just still shocked that we're dealing with Agent Orange 50 plus years after the end of that war.
Yeah,
it's golly.
It's really something. And that was, if you look at how the VA through medical research and studies and years of deciding, okay, if you served, at first it was in country in Vietnam, and then it was brought in to include the Korean DMZ. And then finally, with the passage of the PACT Act, now they include all of our Royal Thai military bases, which is so many of our Air Force veterans who served in Thailand on these bases. And there were a few bases, but that work. And then I think we might have talked about this at our last.
We did. I remember you talking about it because I was like, and Thailand, what does that have to do with Vietnam? But they were there.
They were there. And what's amazing is that even then, even though the bases were deemed presumptive, you still had to have a specific MOS or a job to qualify for that presumption. So we were having to go on appeal, and the veteran would have to recount how they were close to the border and the perimeter of the base.
Some additional duty or DUI or something.
Exactly. No longer. So, and that's just 2 years ago. I mean, this is a very real impact that's happening now. To have these veterans who served in Thailand from January 1962 to June of 1976, that whole time period, now they qualify for Agent Orange presumption is huge. It is so significant. So there's this huge number of veterans who were denied years ago, and think just basic disabilities that you might not think about, like diabetes, mellitus type 2. You can get 40% for diabetes if you meet the criteria for the VA, and you can get your medication, your insulin or your metformin, whatever it is, covered through the VA. And that's a huge incentive for veterans to get
all these sort of maintenance drugs and everything else are so expensive.
Right.
So the healthcare is huge. I mean, obviously they're going back and saying, hey, I was denied for this. The law's changed. That's huge. But I'm like, gosh, how many of these folks are there that, because we're talking, 70-year-olds going to their 80s.
Yeah.
At a minimum.
Yeah. And that's the one, my sort of my biggest current success story is, without sharing too much detail, we were trying to get him service connected under the theory of ionizing radiation. He worked on a nuclear sub that had a reactor spill, and we had great evidence, a nexus letter, which I know is probably something familiar to your listeners, from the VA and a private provider. So we had so much good evidence, but proving even to the 50-50 standard that you were exposed to ionizing radiation is very, very challenging. The VA does not make it easy. And so we were getting nowhere with that. And this veteran filed his claim in 2008, and PACT Act comes through, and he's granted for first condition, second condition, then we add more conditions. And he has so many Agent Orange presumptive conditions that he's now 100% permanent in total. He's gotten tens of thousands of dollars in retroactive pay, and him and his wife are finally free of fighting with the VA, which is what they've done for the greater part of almost 2 years, 20 years, at this point. So
And that's
There
got to
are,
be a very frustrating because when you're exposed to these things, like, hey, this is because of that, and I know it is.
yeah,
And not
that's
like,
yeah.
there's some people like, maybe, maybe not, but nuclear reactors, Agent Orange, come on, we know what we're around.
Oh, yeah, and then veterans really have specific memories of I was handling this or this plane carried it and we unloaded it or the anecdotes are specific. This is not, the VA will see through it if it's like, well, I might have been around Agent Orange. Typically this era of veterans knows exactly their exposure. They know where they were when they were in country or if they were on base. And for many of these veterans, they did multiple tours during the Vietnam War. So
Right.
there's, to have this, and it wasn't even just, and this veteran, I'll add, it was because of his service in Guam that was added under PACT Act. So when the PACT Act increased access to benefits based on either location served or date or time served, it included for this purpose Guam from 1962 to 1980, and
Yeah, because
his
everybody was passing through there.
yeah, and so that's getting that through and having the VA able to concede that, right? Because then there's the issue of record keeping. So, okay, I know I was in Guam, but is it in my service records or my military personnel file? And luckily, in this case, this veteran had jumped through enough hurdles that I think that they finally made it a little bit easy for him towards the end. But had it not been for that Guam concession and addition through the PACT Act, he would still be banging his head against the wall, with all of these conditions that meet the Agent Orange presumption, but no concession of exposure. So
It's always interesting when I look at laws because I see a lot of laws, I read them, and some are written so broad and vague that everything and nothing. Now, this one seems to be very specific and very thoughtfully crafted. It must have been over a number of years where they've, hey, this place in this place and all these places people have deployed. It's not like we deployed combat forces to Guam, like except during World War II,
right,
but it is one of the big jumping off points to the Pacific.
right,
And so, okay, what happened there? Like each thing sounds like it was really sort of well crafted, and
yeah.
some of the issues that have been percolating for years to decades to almost millennia now, I guess.
Yeah, and there, whenever I'm talking to veterans and I'm trying to explain, when I try to explain a decision, I'm not defending the VA. I'm trying to explain what I think the VA is trying to say.
Mhm.
And I have to remind them that the VA doesn't operate under a common sense approach to anything. So it might make so much sense to you that I served here and I have this, and why am I not being granted? But it is much more complex than that. And I think the PACT Act does take a big step in the right direction of simplifying it in some ways because of that, like you said, that research and the history that's there to support the fact that these time periods, yeah, there's likely a lot of research and historical references to the fact that, if you were in the Navy and you served during this time, that's probably where you probably passed through Guam. And they also added Cambodia for a period of time in 1969. And the Thailand, veterans who served at
Mhm.
those Thai bases, it's significant. So certainly if you're a veteran who served during the Vietnam War, you're in the Air Force, or you served on a Royal Thai base and you've been denied, it doesn't guarantee you'll get the benefit, but think about it, reach out. And if you've gotten a letter from the VA, they've done a ton of research and outreach to veterans who were previously denied and to surviving spouses who were previously denied to say, please file. I mean, they are begging people to file claims for under.
I've gotten letters, and I was kind
Yeah,
of surprised, like, because I wasn't really, like, I don't have any pending claims. I don't have anything, like I'm outstanding. But
right.
they sent me a letter saying, hey, based on our records, you likely would be eligible for this, and da da da, and here's how to do it. And it was actually it wasn't super long, but it certainly was very, yeah, hey, this is how you apply. Click here to learn more.
Yeah.
Da da. It was a there was a timeline when it first came out that it would be retroactive for a period of time. And I think that's what they're trying to let a lot of people know. Like, if you put in a claim now, it'll go back for a year, however long it was.
Right.
And so you would have more time, even though the VA decision would take longer
Mm-hmm.
because it's a new law. And I was like, oh, that's really good. Now, it didn't affect me, but
Right.
There's a lot of people who it does affect
Sure.
and needs to go. And now that initial claim period has been more than a year.
Right.
But so the PACT Act, it covers a lot of things. But what are we mentioned the presumptive conditions? Now, obviously, we've talked about Agent Orange and the Vietnam era, and a little bit on the burn pit. But what is the presumptive condition, and so what is the calculus? I guess is really my question. Like, A, deployed, B, these time periods, or you have these conditions and deployed, or what does that math look like? What does
Yeah.
that thought process look like?
It's a good question, and I'll also just add that your point about the date tolling was correct, right? They wanted veterans to file within a year of the passage of the law so they could get the effective date being the date of the law passage, so 8/10 of 22. And they were encouraging veterans to file an intent to file within a year, so before 8/10 of 23 in essence, because even if they had an intent to file and they then file a claim, it would go back to the date of the act being passed. So it really, they really did try to get veterans to come in and to increase the chances that they'd get that retroactive pay, as long as they had a diagnosis of the condition at the time that they filed that claim, whether it's within a year or within a year of their ITF being filed, that would go back to the date of the law. And quickly on effective dates, the only sort of earlier effective date prior to the date of the law that's possible is for surviving spouses. If they had previously filed for what's called DIC, in essence, a death benefit for a service-connected death of a veteran, and they had filed years ago and now they're eligible under PACT, the VA is going back in some cases to the date of that original claim, depending on when it was and what the evidence was at that time. So if you're a surviving spouse or you know a surviving spouse, a widow of a veteran who has passed, and they meet one of these criteria, right? Whether it's Agent Orange exposure or what I'm about to get into, which is, our Gulf War and post 9/11 burn pit era veterans, please file and consider reaching out for help, because what was very difficult to prove previously is now much easier for a huge group of the population. So looking at your most recent question, there are sort of some criteria that you have to meet in order to be eligible for these benefits. So the VA, again, I'm going to give them kudos because they do explain it very well on their website, and it's a resource I've referred to because we want to be sure that we're looking at the right location and the right conditions. So if you served in any of these locations or time periods, you have a presumption of exposure if you served on or after 9/11/01 in any of these locations or the airspace above. And they have Afghanistan, Djibouti, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Uzbekistan, or Yemen. And then prior to that, if you served in any of these locations or time periods or in the airspace above after 8/2 of 90, so this is that first
all the way back to 90,
yeah, that first Gulf War, Bahrain, Iraq, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, and the United Arab Emirates. So that's sort of like the prong one, that if you meet any of those locations, dates of service, even if you step foot in Lebanon after 9/11/01 for a day, even if you were there for a day. And that's sort of that broad interpretation of the law, because they don't define how long you had to be there.
That was actually my next question.
Yeah.
Like, my wife had gone to a number of countries. She was working for the SecDef, and so they would travel like, a day, two, a week at a place.
Mhm.
And she's like, well, I was in Iraq, I was in Afghanistan, but I was there for like 10 days. And I'm like, this counts actually.
Mhm. Yeah.
And she's like, really? I'm like, yeah.
Yeah.
Normally 30 days or 90 days for like, the combat ribbons and deployables
Right.
and things like that. And I said, well, you're kind of TDY, but
Mhm.
it counts for this.
Sure.
And she's like, I don't know about that. And that's a normal reaction among veterans, because you're like, I don't have any combat ribbons or anything to just show other than some TDY orders.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, that is a huge change. So
Yeah.
if you were there at all on duty in any of these locations, that's prong one.
That's prong one. And prong two is, what is your disabling condition? So they have it distinguished between cancers and illnesses. So this Gulf War era post 9/11 eligibility for cancers is massive. So brain cancer, gastrointestinal cancer of any kind, glioblastoma, which is a type of brain cancer, head cancer of any type, kidney cancer, lymphatic cancer of any type, lymphoma of any type, melanoma, neck cancer, pancreatic cancer, reproductive cancer of any type. So for both men and women, and then any respiratory type of cancer. So
wow.
It's almost hard to think of any other type of cancer that isn't included in this pretty comprehensive list.
I'm sure one of these doctors could come up with some,
yeah,
but that sounds like a lot of them.
Yeah, it's pretty broad. And then there's the cancer list, and then there's the illnesses, which is where we're seeing a lot of these claims come through: asthma, chronic bronchitis, COPD, chronic rhinitis, chronic sinusitis, chronic bronchiolitis or obliterative bronchiolitis, emphysema, granulomatous disease, interstitial lung disease, pleuritis, pulmonary fibrosis, and sarcoidosis. So, very respiratory heavy on this list of illnesses, which is broader, which is more limiting, I think, than the cancers. The cancers are very broad because you have many body types, whereas a lot of these illnesses typically are the respiratory conditions, which I think goes back to the idea that you're inhaling these toxic chemicals either near the burn pits or in passing or during your deployment. So it factors in this very broad range of toxic exposures. But yeah, so if you served in those places, and again, the VA does a great job. If you're listening to this thinking, that sounds like a deployment I had, the va.gov PACT Act, see if you qualify for that sort of first prong, which is, did I serve at that time during that period at that location? Did I serve on or after 9/11, 01 in any of these locations? Did I serve on or after 8/2 of 90 in any of these locations? And if you did, and you have one of these conditions, that presumption is there for you. So if you
no longer have to be like, hey, my tent was right next to the burn pits and all night it was smoldering. You don't have to prove any of that. You were there. That's the easy part now, because you used to have to show like a really direct relationship to, like, hey, I was like, my cabin was full of smoke, or my tent or whatever.
Oh yeah, the testimony I remember of veterans in Vietnam talking about their hooches and what they would feel coming through Agent Orange, trying to establish that they were exposed to Agent Orange on a Thai base because here's where we were next to the perimeter and we didn't leave, and if we did leave, we went into the town and we came right back, and the testimony had to be so specific, and even asking for letters from people that went to visit them, for example, to verify or corroborate that what they said happened. And same thing up until the passage of the PACT Act for veterans who had that sort of exposure. It wasn't something that I think veterans thought about at the time, right? When they're serving, they're obviously, and you maybe even be able to speak to that, you're not thinking about, well, this is really bad for my lungs right now. You're focused on the mission.
Coughing at the time.
Right.
Or in discomfort at the moment. You're not thinking about it. Same thing with depleted uranium or any of these other things. You're firing the next round.
Right.
But yeah, when you're there, unless it's causing like issues at the moment, like, oh, I can't stop coughing.
Right.
I'm going to move to another tent or something.
Right.
You're not thinking about it at the moment. There's a million other things like incoming and, what's the next ice cream and surf and turf,
and that right there is, I think it makes a veteran feel, hopefully it gives them sort of the ability to exhale a sigh of relief, because they don't have to try to prove, they don't have to go back and relive what they went through, which is, a very difficult thing, especially when we're going through a mental health claim and we're trying to notice that none of these conditions are mental health related, right? That hasn't changed at all. So for this era of veterans who are struggling with mental health issues, their struggles are in some ways the same. This helps with a lot of these other conditions that they might be experiencing, but that doesn't change, what's going on. It's sort of the unseen disability, the invisible disability of mental health struggles. So Certainly, there's still very important claims that we recommend filing, and there's a really good way to go about that. But part of the struggle with those claims is reliving what you went through, and that's very challenging for a lot of veterans. And now they don't have to do that. They don't have to go and talk about what they were going through on that deployment. You can usually just look through their service records or their military personnel file or any deployment history, say, okay, you served. And there's actually it's called a Terra memo that is being associated with a veteran's file in their VA file. If they have that Terra concession, that toxic exposure risk assessment.
Okay. I was going to ask you what that meant.
Yeah. And I should have said that first. But we're seeing that when we
the lingo. So yeah,
when we see a claim and we see sort of a VA review, and there's more automation coming through that we see with the VA. But when we see that, there's that concession that the veteran has that toxic exposure, it opens up the doors for them. And of course, we're still seeing VA deny because they are still the VA, but we can push back on that so easily. And we've had a lot of success doing that with, file a claim for a PACT Act presumption, should be straightforward. 9 times out of 10 it is, but this time they get denied. We can do a higher level review, which is essentially us asking the VA to look at this because you've made a clear error of law or fact. Veteran clearly served during X period, clearly has X cancer or illness, so he should be granted. And that has been successful as well. We just need to educate the VA sometimes when it comes to their quick denials.
Yeah, it's a bureaucracy. I mean, that's the reality. And, the juxtaposition between the VA sending all these letters and reaching out to everyone that they think or have some reason to believe would be eligible for the PACT Act claim and pushing it is so contrary to the belief that so many veterans have that the VA is just trying to screw me.
Yeah.
When they're doing a lot of effort and work to reach out to folks to file claims.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody at the VA is maliciously doing anything. It's a bureaucracy. They got to make sure all the boxes are checked. Right. And then they go, absolutely. If they miss something, okay, bad things, somebody who is eligible got denied. But there's the reason the VSOs are there and everything else to fix it. Right. But it is kind of that juxtaposition, right? Like, hey, we expect them to deny things that they shouldn't. Well, they're also going, hey, you are totally eligible for this. Based on our stuff, you should probably file a claim.
Right. I've never seen such a campaign to invite claims. And I've been doing this going on 6 years. And I remember when the Blue Water Navy Act was passed and there was a lot of outreach there, but that only moved the needle so far because it didn't expanded the location, for our Blue Water Navy veterans, but it eventually added hypothyroidism and Parkinsonianism and one other condition that I also talked about in my last podcast that is escaping me right now.
Look it up, folks. The last interview with Samantha Allen, it's great. So if go listen to that one too. It's still totally valid.
But that that outreach for my veteran, for example, who wasn't granted until Guam was added. He got that letter under the Blue Water Navy Act, but he still wasn't granted. So it moved the needle a little bit. The PACT Act truly has made it possible for many, many veterans to get, and that's why so many claims are being filed, over 1 million as of the fall.
Is that a lot more? Like, what is that in comparison to like 100,000 or like, it's always that challenge of like, oh, that's so many, but is that just saying, and it may be a lot. I mean, if they're touting it, it's probably a lot.
It's a lot more, I think they still, and they have a lot of, information on their website about how many claims they're processing. I have never tracked it as closely as the PACT Act because I think that the campaign to invite claims has been so broad and so targeted at the same time for people who actually can benefit from refiling these claims. And we're seeing them for, widows go back to the date that they were granted. I mean, we're seeing retroactive payments and pretty large numbers. So I think that, the number of claims that are filed is always a high number, right? Because how they track it is sort of, yes, number of claims filed, but also how long it takes for them to process a claim. And for what I do on appeals, that timeline is pretty extraordinary. So for a veteran right now who gets denied and files an appeal and requests a hearing with a judge, it's a 3-year wait for your hearing. And
It's
if
funny.
you,
I literally asked Bill the other day when I was talking to him, your colleague at the Department of Veteran Services. I said, "Well, all right. So you've got these different levels of reviews, and how long is it if you go to the appeals board? Actually, the administrative law judge. Oh,
Mhm.
3 to 5 years." And I
Yeah.
was like, "Yeah, that's a long time."
And that 3 to 5 years encompasses, waiting for your hearing, but also getting your decision after your hearing.
Hmm.
I just had a veteran who was granted back to 2018 because his claim was filed in 2018. He had his hearing with me in August of 22. We just got his decision last week, January 24. So that's a year and a half
After
after
the hearing.
hearing. And it
Wow.
was granted back to 2018, which is great. But now we're also contesting the evaluation they assigned because he hasn't been examined by the VA in 6 years. And they used data from the original claim to assign an evaluation, and he should have been reevaluated by the VA. So now we're having to file a supplemental claim to demonstrate that he should have been examined and he's entitled to a higher rating. So the timeline just continues. Our caseload, it grows because the time it takes for kind of finality and resolution is it seems like infinity sometimes. It's a very, very long process. And that's why when a veteran gets granted, I'm like, you know, take the money and run, like just be done fighting with the VA if you can be, right? If you've got your rating, if you've got your health care, if you've got whatever it is you are seeking, which again, I don't think is going to make them whole, but I think it helps in a lot of ways, whether it's the validation or the acknowledgement or the compensation, whatever the motivation is,
Hmm.
once they have that, I would say close that chapter and go enjoy, the next chapter, which is maybe using that money to save for a grandchild to go to college or pay off a debt that you've had or whatever you decide to do with it. It's your money and it's tax free, which is what we're
Huge.
so it's so exciting for veterans to get that after all of these years. And the PACT Act is doing a lot for the compensation piece, but for all the people who have perished from the illnesses and the cancers from Agent Orange exposure or burn pit exposure, we can do is try to help them get access to these resources in this next chapter of their life and be an ear for them. We have a lot of widows who got these letters who unfortunately didn't meet the criteria for different reasons, whether their late veteran didn't serve in the right place or they didn't have the specific condition. Like you'll notice I said melanoma has been added for the Gulf War and post 9/11 veterans, but melanoma is not considered a presumptive of Agent Orange exposure. And so we're still having to fight on a direct service connection basis to get those veterans granted. So we have plenty of work to do, with keeping us busy. This has been a really nice law to be able to celebrate the benefits because they are sweeping and they are real for so many people.
So the real takeaway is if this applies to you, even if you've applied in the past for like asthma or sinusitis or any of these other conditions, I only mention those because I have both those,
Okay.
and so I'm very aware of the rules and they're very strict and there's
Mhm.
very all sorts of medical things, and then also trying to prove that it was related to service. Now, if
Mhm.
you served a short term or you deployed most of your time and then you got out, it can be very difficult to prove. So this sort of lays the groundwork. Hey, you deployed and you have this, boom, you're eligible. There's a bunch of others, all those cancers, there's a whole bunch of them. Anything to do with the brain, the respiratory, reproductive, that's a huge bunch of stuff, especially for the 9/11 folks.
Mhm.
But go look at the illnesses that are presumptive, because if you deployed and you have one of those, some of them are much more common than others. Emphysema is probably a little less. Sarcoidosis is probably a little less, but bronchitis or COPD, lots
Mhm.
of people with COPD.
Mhm.
So if you have those conditions and you deployed, you're probably eligible. Go file. It doesn't cost you anything. But I was also thinking about what Bill said the other day when I was talking with him about when to file a claim. If you've had the rating for less than 5 years, you're at the 4-year mark, Wait till you have the full 5 years
Mhm.
before you start muddling things up, because they're going to go back and reevaluate, and you may not want that.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's some calculus involved, some thinking, some understanding of the rules and processes. It's a bureaucracy. It's way less personal than anybody would ever think, based on some
Mhm.
of the veterans. It's nothing personal. It's all paperwork.
Yeah.
And
Mm.
yeah, that's a real hard takeaway sometimes, when people think it's like, oh, they're out to screw me.
Yeah.
No, it's not everybody, and it's not even one person.
Yeah.
The system doesn't care.
And I think that's one of the harder parts, is because when the empathy that you're not going to get from the VA that I feel is so important in this process is that there is a veteran behind that decision. So when you're denying that veteran and you're saying, well, nothing happened in service and you don't have this diagnosis and no favorable findings and you need new and relevant evidence and you don't have any. I mean, you're just getting knocked down every peg, and it's very debilitating for veterans who are feeling so defeated through this massive bureaucratic process. And, one I'm thinking of right now, going back and forth with him and his wife, he's like, I feel like when I read that decision, they're talking about a different veteran. They can't be talking about me, because clearly I have this condition and clearly I should be rated at a high rating. This is for actually a PACT Act presumptive veteran, but he keeps getting his lung condition rated at 0%, even though he really does meet a higher criteria. And he's like, what are they not looking at? What is going on? And those questions are tough to answer, because is it a sloppy copy and paste job from a new VA employee who
Mhm.
didn't have their rating reviewed before it was sent out? Maybe. And I can't defend that. All I can do is try to be solution oriented and stay in that sort of problem solving mindset of, we have to push back, we have to give them what they need. And if we have to appeal, it is challenging right now because it is such a long wait. And
Yeah.
unless you are over 75 or at risk of homelessness or in a state of financial hardship or terminally ill, you're waiting
Yeah.
3 years right now.
I mean,
And
it is personal for the veteran. Don't
yeah,
get me wrong.
yeah,
And you know where you search, and you can look at the evidence and go, yeah, this is totally makes sense. I have X, I was Y, and you know your story.
yeah.
And do mistakes happen all day long? Is there a high turnover of people doing the evaluations? Yes. Is it
Mhm.
really kind of high pressure, low grade, junior work? Yes, unfortunately.
Yeah,
It's not like they have teams of lawyers and medical professionals that are reading these and understand all the terms and the pathologies. No, it's like
right.
secretary level type of work
Yeah,
that they're going through, and they're great people, but it's also very difficult. There's a lot of rules and a lot of things that they're not aware of,
yeah,
not necessarily, especially
yeah,
since they have a lot of turnover. And so
right.
mistakes happen. Yeah. But there is no grand scheme at the VA going, let's
Right.
screw as many people as we can,
Yeah.
so we can save some money.
I've heard people, because there's this huge kind of push to get to 100% for a lot of reasons, right? The income that you're receiving, the tax break you get if you're Chapter 35 eligible, permanently and totally disabled. And I've had veterans who, Bill may have touched on this in some ways in his last podcast, but when they get close to 100 and then they get proposed to be reduced, some veterans think, well, they must be doing that because they don't want me to get to 100%. They must see that I'm close and they are proposing to reduce me so I don't get to 100%. And I said, you're giving the VA way too much credit. There is no way that they know that you are that close. It is all an algorithm. I think
Hmm.
that when you push and push, that getting to 100% from 90 is very challenging. Getting to 90 is challenging. And I think for
Right.
some people, they will spend decades doing that. And others, are able to get 90% with a BDD claim right out of either retirement or separation. And then maybe getting to 100 is something that will happen naturally, or maybe it's not their goal. But we are seeing a huge rise in veterans who are trying to get to 100%, or when they do
Yeah.
get to 100%, they want to stay there and have sort of, put roots into that 100% and keep that permanent and total status. And that's challenging because we can't guarantee anything, right? You're still
Right.
working with the VA, and if someone picks up your claim and they notice something, or you file an increase and you shouldn't have, then the VA is going to put you sort of back in that churning of, well, this is a claim and it's going to be worked by 10 different people over the course of however many months. And you're going to get an outcome. You're either going to love it or you're going to hate it. And that's very frustrating for advocates and for veterans, and less so for the VA, right? Because they're doing their job. Like you said, this is sort of administrative secretarial work that
processing.
They're doing.
The next step. Yeah, Bill did talk about that a little bit. We didn't really talk about the 100% directly, but yes, there is a lot more people that are going for 100% that arguably probably is a bit more of a stretch of the evidence sometimes, based on my own experience with dealing with a lot of veterans. I'm sure you have your own experience, but I'm not going to ask because that's a whole different issue. but yeah, that's you're putting yourself at risk. Now, the PACT Act does remove a lot of the barriers that did exist, and that's a very important takeaway, because you used to have to prove all sorts of things, and then these presumptives are absolutely fantastic for veterans. If you meet X, I was there. B, I have the thing, whatever the thing is.
Right.
As long as it's one of the presumptive conditions, you're getting a rating that's going to be positive. It might be 0% based on how much it's affecting you.
Right.
But like most cancers are 100% while they're active.
Exactly.
And then the residuals. So that's a huge issue. But also you get the medical care for anything related to it. And that's another huge, massive cost, because anybody who's dealt with medical costs, that's actually the best thing about, I think, the PACT Act is like extra health insurance for any of these conditions.
And treatment, I mean, especially if you're in an active cancer state and you're having to either do chemotherapy or radiation or both or surgery, and you can do that through the VA. I had my first PACT Act veteran was a veteran who we filed before the PACT Act came out, and then he became terminal. He had glioblastoma. It was a brain tumor. It's non-curable and fatal, of course. And once he took a turn, we were able to motion for an advancement on the docket because of his terminal illness. And we got a hearing scheduled within a week, and we got him granted everything for his condition. And he ended up passing about 4 months later. And thank goodness we were able to do that so quickly. And this was probably the most positive, optimistic person I've ever worked with. Him and his spouse were absolutely lovely. And we were so grateful because we were able to get them granted. And with great evidence, they actually gave him the effective date that was of the date he filed the claim. And that's another sort of big advocacy tip. If you have an ongoing claim or appeal that's been long-standing prior to the PACT Act, don't withdraw it and go file a new claim under PACT Act, because if we can try to argue for direct service connection and get you that earliest date possible, that effective date of that date of claim, we want to do that. And if you withdraw it and you file a new claim, you're only going to get the claim effective date of either the PACT Act if you filed within a year of the passage, or the ITF that you might have filed. But safeguarding that effective date is crucial. And it's not possible for everyone, right? If the evidence isn't there, but under PACT Act, it's there, you're going to get that August 10 of 22 date. But I have an active appeal for a veteran who meets the presumption under PACT Act for breast cancer, right? Reproductive cancer of any type, filed her claim in 2016, and we're still waiting for that board decision. We have great nexus letters. We have great evidence, in-service complaint. We're pushing for direct service connection because we know she's going to get it under PACT, but we want her to get her effective date for her date of claim. And that's something the PACT Act, that's one thing that the PACT Act is, we sort of tread lightly with, because we want the effective date of the PACT Act if that's our only option. But if you have a long-standing appeal or claim, do not withdraw it. Keep that active. And if we can make that argument for direct service connection, which is always an option for anyone, right? The presumption makes it easier, but direct service connection is always an avenue. So we want to push that direct service connection where possible, maximize benefits for the veteran and the surviving spouse. And so that's another kind of advocacy tip that we're making sure that people, because at first when the PACT Act came out, we didn't, it sort of what do we do? Do we want a quicker decision? Should we withdraw and file a new claim? And our consensus as the appeals team was, don't touch it, leave it alone. We want these claims to sort of go through the system, even though it's going to take longer. And so we're really waiting for decisions. We are right in the thick of it right now. So that, massive campaign to file claims and invite claims, it's very real and ongoing. And Virginia Department of Veteran Services, happy to help, and any other VSO. I know DAV is doing a lot for the PACT Act, and they're very outspoken and trying to help with veterans, and all the other VSOs you can think of. But you should not pay for help when it comes to this sort of service. We're seeing a huge rise in entities that are charging too much and promising something that they really can't guarantee to a veteran. And
hey, hire us and we'll get you 100%.
Yes. And we're asking a lot on the compensation side. They're charging a lot of money for either nexus letters or this sort of like ad hoc service where they're not an attorney. They're like an organization, and there's many of them popping up. So it's not just one, but we are having veterans come to us and saying, well, this group helped me with my claim, and now they're not answering their phone. And, I was denied, or I'm proposed to be reduced. Bill had a wild story recently about that sort of situation. So always be, wary when it comes to entities who are asking, promising what they can't deliver, because you can't promise anything in this space, right? We can say you should be entitled based on the fact that you meet all the criteria, but you might still, if you get denied, we have recourse, right? We can do a supplemental claim or appeal, what have you. So PACT Act has a lot of good there, but like with anything, we have to tread lightly. And, we don't want you to file on your own. We want you to reach out, and I'm available, phone or email, as is Bill and my team. And you do such a great job educating veterans and this demographic. So reach out to Tyler too.
Yeah, reach out. The Department of Veteran Services is all over the state, all over the Commonwealth. And they're distributed. So there's a lot of folks you can reach out, and the appeals team is obviously doing a lot of the appeals, but they have a lot of VSOs that are throughout the entire Commonwealth. Go reach out to them. It's super easy. Sam, I had one last question. When you've alluded to it, and I don't think that it makes any difference, but just to clear it up, if you're filing for a PACT Act, is there anything different you have to do to file for a PACT Act claim versus any other claim?
No, there's not. There is now they created a new form. So the VA form 526EZ actually has, I believe, a question that asks about that toxic exposure. Like, were you exposed to X, Y, or Z? So I think it makes it a little easier on the front end on the claim to narrow down what you're claiming, but it's still the same.
Put a stamp on it. Hey, this is a PACT Act claim.
Right, exactly. And so you can do it the same way. And actually, they've made it very easy for veterans to do it on their own. While we still think you should work with someone, they made it very easy online to say what you're filing for. So, same claim process, but if you're filing for a condition that's a PACT Act presumptive, you can just put it right on there, right? Like asthma due to burn pit exposure in Iraq. And by the time that claim gets to your file, there should already be a concession that you meet that criteria, because they did this massive automated review, in essence, assigning this presumption preemptively for these veterans. So I think that's probably a part of the campaign to invite claims. They had to be ready for these claims. So they had to sort of have this low-hanging fruit of, does this veteran qualify? Are they eligible and are they entitled? So a lot of that is already in the file. Even if you haven't filed yet, there's going to be a notation of whether or not you meet the presumption under PACT Act. And so nothing changes for you. Some stuff changes on the VA side, hopefully to make it easier to grant you, though.
That makes that process. They don't have to go digging through your records. Hey, yep, they meet it. Boom. Okay.
Right.
They have it. Boom. Good.
Exactly.
How bad is it? I guess that's the next step. And then boom, you get a decision. Do you think that is facilitating faster decisions because of the presumptions? Now, I know it's not been a long time. It's been a little less than a year since it's been fully implemented, but
yeah, overall, I think so. Faster than what I see on appeal is is
Yes, appeals are.
definitely, so what I see with claims and supplemental claims and higher level reviews, I think it's faster. I will say what's taking a very long time are the non-PACT Act presumptive claims. So I think that there is a big push to get these PACT Act claims processed, but like for a claim for a pension for a veteran, for surviving spouse, or either a pension claim or a DIC claim for a service-connected death attempt to get that granted, those are taking a very long time, unfortunately. So I am seeing quicker grants within months, under 6 months for the one I just worked on, filed in September and is now permanent in total,
Wow,
less than 6 months later. So that's a very quick,
that is very fast.
very quick path. And he wasn't advanced on the docket due to age or anything like that. So that's just a sort of a run of the mill, if you will, veteran filing a claim with no flashes for, fast tracking it, no Purple Heart, nothing like that, that might make things move along a little bit quicker. So yeah, I think it is quicker. I think that the appeals are still a huge weight, but it's worthwhile if you have a complex issue of law or fact, or you're getting nowhere with supplemental claim after supplemental claim, and you want to get before a judge and have that conversation. There's a lot of value to that, but we're not having to file as many appeals right now because of, for example, the Thailand veterans, right? We don't have to appeal to get to a judge to explain they were on the perimeter. Now it's granted under PACT. So there's been a kind of sort of a shift in the workload, I think.
So it's no longer 3 to 5 years waiting for a judge. It's, hey, yeah, boom, done. Obviously, you've talked a little bit about it. If you have an existing appeal, if existing process, you want that to keep going because the effective date could be years to many years in the past, and that's the effective date, and that's when your benefits would have started. So that's definitely a benefit to keep that going.
Yes.
As always, consult a VSO, especially someone who focuses on appeals before making any of those decisions. The Department of Veteran Services, in full transparency, is my VSO. They have any of my claims. They're the people that reach out, and they do a fantastic job here in the Commonwealth. Each state has a similar organization. The Department of Veteran Services here in the Commonwealth is fantastic, but there's fantastic ones across the country. Go reach out to them, or any of the other VSOs, American Legion, VFW. There's so many excellent organizations, but don't pay for it, folks. All these things about, hey, we'll get you a Nexus letter, we'll get you this, and we'll get you 100%, and we'll only charge you many thousands of dollars or some percentage of whatever we can recover. That's not quite always legal, depends on what state you are in, but also they can't promise anything. Anybody who promises anything from the VA is either corrupt or lying to you. It's one of the two. So that's it. Yeah. So reach out to your local VSOs, the ones everybody knows. There's some other great ones, just because you may not be as aware they're in this space, but yeah, you can go check them out. There's a lot of really good ones. If they're charging you, be very suspicious and get some other advice, because that isn't always the best course of action. Might set you up. As we were talking the other day, the only reason that you can have a claim that's been for 20 years is because of fraud. So don't put yourself in that pickle if it's not quite legit, because they can. As a former special agent, I will tell you that we will dig back 20 years and find something and go, oh, this doesn't look kosher, and then dig into it more, and then you have a horrible time. Because everything from that point forward is considered fruit of the fraud. So that's a very bad situation. So don't do that. Sam, thank you so much for joining us on Coming Home Well. I certainly appreciate everything that Department of Veteran Services here in the Commonwealth does, but especially the appeals folks. You guys are such a wealth of resources. Thank you again.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and appreciate you taking the time and educating veterans in the way you do, and hope to talk to you again soon.
All right, take care.
Thanks for joining us this week on Coming Home Well with Dr. Tyler Piron. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and a review. Thanks again. And until all are home and all are well, this is Coming Home Well.